I didn't know then how easy it is to disappear inside your own family. People think vanishing happens all at once, with noise or anger, but that's not how it works. Sometimes it happens politely, one small adjustment at a time, until you realize you're still breathing, but no longer seen. Everyone thought I was lucky to still have a roof over my head. That was the story they told themselves so they wouldn't have to look closer. They said I should be grateful, that at my age you don't ask for more than a warm bed and a locked door. What no one noticed was how carefully that roof stopped feeling like mine. I lived there, yes, but I lived like permission could be taken back any day. I am 70 now, old enough to understand the difference between being sheltered and being rooted. When my son asked me to move in, I thought he was offering me belonging. I didn't know he was offering me space with conditions. My husband had been gone 5 winters by then. Not long enough for the ache to leave, but long enough for people to assume I had adjusted. I learned a long time ago that grief makes others uncomfortable, so I carry it quietly. My son, Michael, spoke gently when he said it. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone anymore." His voice had that familiar confidence, the kind he uses when he wants things smooth, not complicated. I heard love in it, and maybe that was my mistake. His wife, Laura, wrapped her arms around me the first day, right there on the front porch, while a neighbor watered her lawn and smiled. "We're so happy you're here," Laura said, loud enough to be overheard. She called me Mom like she'd been practicing. Inside the house, her hand slipped from mine before the door even closed. It was small, almost nothing, but I noticed. I always notice. The house itself was neat, suburban, comfortable in a way that looks good from the outside. Trimmed hedges, quiet street, flags on porches during holidays. The kind of place where people assume everyone inside is fine. They gave me the small room near the laundry. Laura called it cozy, said it with a smile that waited for agreement. I gave it to her. I said it was perfect even though the window barely caught the sun and the walls hummed when the dryer ran. I told myself light doesn't matter as much as peace. I brought one suitcase. I didn't want to look like I was settling in too deeply. The first week felt careful, like everyone was trying not to step on each other's toes. Voices stayed pleasant. Doors closed softly. Laura thanked me for offering to help, but she never actually let me. "Just relax," she said, reorganizing the kitchen cabinets the next morning so I wouldn't know where anything belonged. Michael worked late, came home tired, kissed the kids on their heads, asked me if I was comfortable. I said yes, because I didn't want to sound like a problem he had to solve. I learned quickly that comfort wasn't the point. Harmony was. Laura liked things a certain way. Towels folded crisp. Shoes lined straight. Groceries placed where she preferred. My things stayed in my room because the rest of the house felt borrowed. I found my place without being told. It was the chair at the end of the table, the one no one else reached for. Laura spoke warmly about me on the phone, telling friends how nice it was to have help, how sweet it was that I still liked my routines. When she spoke to me alone, her voice flattened, efficient, like a reminder on a calendar. She never raised it. She didn't need to. She reminded me which shelves were hers, why my laundry could wait, how the kids needed quiet, and my television was a little much. I lowered the volume. I lowered myself. Michael waved things off when I hinted at feeling out of place. "You're reading too much into it, Mom," he said once, not looking up from his phone. "You know how Laura is. She just wants things peaceful." Peaceful. That word became a wall. Peaceful meant no questions. Peaceful meant adjustment only went one way. I told myself I had survived worse. I had raised a child on one income. I had stood beside a man through sickness and watched him fade without complaint. I could handle a little discomfort. What I hadn't prepared for was how invisibility slowly teaches you to erase yourself. The kids, Jason and Lily, weren't unkind. They were simply distant in the way children learn to be. They stepped around me, not toward me. They stopped asking me to read at night. Laura said they were busy. I believed her because believing her was easier than wondering. I started eating earlier alone because family dinners felt crowded in a way that had nothing to do with chairs. Plates were cleared quickly. Conversations moved past me like I was background noise. If I spoke, there was a brief pause, polite, and then someone checked their phone. The house was never loud. That was the trick. No shouting, no slammed doors, nothing you could point to and call cruelty. Just a constant awareness that I was there by tolerance, not by right. I folded myself smaller each day, thinking that was the price of staying. People outside said I was lucky. I nodded along because gratitude is easier to perform than truth. I started noting little rules that weren't rules at all. The towels had to be straight, the chairs had to face a certain way, the fridge needed organizing in a pattern only Laura understood. If I touched anything, she gave me that slight raised brow, just a tilt that could mean thank you or don't do that again. Michael never saw it. His eyes were elsewhere, or maybe he wanted the house to stay peaceful too. I began to move in shadows, aligning my steps with Laura's schedule. I folded my routines into the margins of her life. I smiled when she passed, nodded when the kids asked something I didn't want to answer, and never claimed more than my room, my chair, my silence. And yet, I was always aware. The walls whispered of permission, the rooms hummed with limits. The air itself seemed to measure my existence. I found myself memorizing small details, which glasses she preferred, which books stayed on the shelves, which side of the street the mail carrier lingered longest. Observation became my comfort. I told myself I was learning, not surviving. I started to catalog how peace looked when it wasn't mine. Late nights, when Michael's car left the driveway and the house sank into shadows, I allowed myself a sigh, long and quiet. I would sit by the laundry window, listening to the street hum, the neighbor's wind chime, even the faint shuffle of Lily's pajamas across the floor. It felt like the world had stopped noticing me. And maybe it had. I learned how to occupy space without being part of it. I could move, speak, laugh, even cry, but only in small increments, only in the gaps of her life. I began noting how little touches of acknowledgement could shift everything. A smile in the right moment. A quiet nod during dinner. A spoon left on the table in perfect alignment. The house rewarded me in whispers, not in conversation. I realized, painfully, that being allowed to stay is not the same as belonging. Every inch of the house was mapped to someone else's comfort. Every sentence spoken in kindness came with an unspoken ledger. I was present but invisible. I learned that staying quiet didn't make me safe, it made me tolerated. By the third month, the room felt like a museum exhibit rather than a living space. My suitcase became permanent, my habits shrank into corners. I talked less, asked less, intervened less. I rehearsed my reactions, learned to smile on cue, and fold my grief into the gaps between household chores. Even Michael's gentle gestures couldn't pierce the new rules of coexistence. I told myself I was practicing patience, but deep down I understood I was learning to disappear. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest trick of all. You can be under the same roof, share the same meals, witness the same sunrises, and still not belong. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was a matter of adjustment. I didn't know yet how expensive that belief would become. Every morning began the same way, quiet and careful, like tiptoeing through a house of glass, knowing one wrong step could erase you further. The soft whir of the dryer, the hum of the fridge, the faint scrape of chairs, all cues to measure, to anticipate, to adjust. I moved like a ghost through my own home, learning the subtle choreography of existing without presence. Michael would linger just long enough in the kitchen to grab his coffee, muttering a quick, "Come on, Mom, you're overthinking again, relax," before disappearing into the soft buzz of his workday. It was never malicious, just inattentive, and in his peace-over-truth mindset, he created space for quiet cruelty I was still learning to navigate. Breakfast was a study in patience. Laura poured coffee with precision, her smile polite, unremarkable, but each gesture was controlled, timed, measured. Toast was lightly burnt, placed neatly on a plate that sat on the counter until I picked it up, never offered directly. One day, I reached for a container of leftover chicken salad, and she gave me that tiny head tilt, a glance sharp enough to slice through my quiet claim without a word. "Honey, don't touch that, I've got it covered. Thanks though," she said casually, and that was enough. No slammed doors. No raised voices. Just dominance in the subtlest of movements. I told myself it was trivial, that it didn't matter. But every tilt, every glance, every redirection was a map of exclusion, a quiet reminder that my existence here was conditional, tolerated but not embraced. I noticed the kids mirrored her precision. Jason left his backpack carefully on the hallway edge. Lily stacked her toys in neat rows just beyond my reach. They weren't cruel. They were learning. Every small act of control Laura modeled, they absorbed. I became keenly aware that silence was protecting them, not me. Every smile I gave, every nod I offered, was a calculation, a test of how far I could stretch without breaking the invisible rules. Lunches became lessons in invisibility. Laura controlled timing, placement, even utensils. I would serve myself only when she was busy rearranging plates, or I'd retreat to the dining nook that felt most neutral, least claimed by her authority. Michael's glances were fleeting, almost distracted, his mind elsewhere, never fully perceiving the quiet erosion of my autonomy. I began to document it mentally, noting how cupboards were labeled, how certain snacks were reserved without announcement, how my coffee mug would sometimes be placed at the back of the shelf if I didn't align perfectly with Laura's timing. Afternoons were a test of endurance. The house had rhythms I learned to respect, the pattern of chores, the order in which rooms were attended to, the way shadows fell across the living room at specific hours. I became adept at blending into the rhythm, choosing corners and timings that allowed me to exist without interference. Even minor interactions required precision. When Jason dropped a crayon near my chair, or Lily handed me a toy, Laura's near-imperceptible redirection reminded me that my gestures had boundaries. These weren't confrontations, they were corrections so subtle they felt like background noise. Sometimes, a neighbor's casual remark caught my attention. "Is she settling in okay?" They would ask lightly, unaware of the tension simmering beneath polite smiles. It made me pause, notice patterns I had begun to overlook, the way Laura orchestrated everything to maintain appearances, the way Michael's detachment allowed the silent control to persist. These micro-triggers were tiny pricks that sharpened my awareness, readying me for what was to come. Evenings were exercises in patience and observation. Laughter from the kids echoed in the hallway. Bouncing off walls I had learned to respect silently. Laura allowed proximity, but dictated the pace, the tone, the content. I moved cautiously, joining conversations lightly, smiling when appropriate, nodding when necessary. I existed in the margins. I moved like a shadow. Nobody noticed. That was the trick. Michael's passive presence reinforced the pattern. He prioritized comfort over clarity, peace over justice, and in doing so, perpetuated the quiet cruelty that surrounded me. I began cataloging every detail, the subtle eye rolls, the slight pauses before she spoke to me, the way items were consistently placed just out of immediate reach. I studied the children's mimicry, noting when their gestures reflected learned behavior rather than natural inclination. I collected evidence in my mind, not for confrontation yet, but to fortify my understanding. Every day became a map of control, a topography of exclusion. I began to see Laura's efficiency as strategy, her calm perfection as power. And in these silent observations, I started to recognize a truth I had been skirting. My own presence was being minimized deliberately, consistently, by design. Sometimes, Michael would offer a passing comment, "Mom, relax, you're reading too much into it," as if dismissing not just the discomfort, but the reality I navigated daily. I smiled politely, but inside, I cataloged the dismissal as another layer of my silent education. I was learning to endure, to observe, to adapt while maintaining dignity. I noticed the house's subtle cues, the exact moment Laura would sweep into the hallway, the timing of chores, the small rearrangements that excluded me without confrontation. I learned to anticipate, to occupy space without challenging it, to exist quietly in the shadows of my own life. By mid-evening, I would sit near the window, cataloging, observing, analyzing. Patterns were clear now. The invisible boundaries, the controlled interactions, the silent authority. I could predict movements, anticipate comments, and navigate rooms with minimal friction. I existed fully aware, fully observing, yet outwardly compliant. Every quiet moment, every shadowed movement, every subtle correction reinforced the lesson. To be tolerated was not to belong. And that awareness, collected meticulously day by day, became my edge, tucked close, ready for the day I finally carved out a place that was truly mine. The sun hit the blinds in streaks, painting lines across the hardwood floor, and for the first time in months, I noticed how little of the house felt like mine. I had been moving through it, a careful shadow, noting patterns, measuring each step, each glance, each minor shift of attention. But today, something felt different. Something in the air was tinged with a weight that I couldn't yet name. It started innocuously. A delivery guy, a young man with a bright blue cap and oversized backpack, arrived just after Michael left for work. I had been standing by the door, hands folded, pretending to check the mail when he rang. Laura answered immediately, crisp and efficient, her tone perfectly polite. "Hi, thanks. Just leave it right here. We'll handle it." She gestured to the corner of the kitchen. He hesitated, looked at me, then set the package down gingerly, like stepping on fragile glass. And then he asked, casually, almost like a throwaway question, "So, how long are you visiting?" The words sliced through the careful routine I had been living in. "Visiting?" I stared, frozen. My hands clenched around the mail, knuckles white. I wanted to answer, to explain, to justify my presence in the house that I had called home for months now. But no words came. My throat tightened, my chest constricted, and I realized in the plainest, quietest way that I had been living as a guest, never as a resident. I had permission to stay, but no belonging had ever been granted. I retreated to the corner, letting Laura handle the delivery, noting the ease with which she orchestrated the interaction. Michael would have shrugged, handed over his wallet, signed a receipt, and moved on. That was his way, peace over truth, convenience over understanding. And the kids. I glimpsed Jason peeking from behind the stair railing, mimicking Laura's poised stance, Lily clutching a doll, waiting for approval. Observing them, I felt the full weight of the inheritance Laura was unconsciously building. Habits, control, a subtle hierarchy that rendered me almost invisible. I catalogued it all. Every tilt of the head, every gentle nudge, every invisible boundary. Each micro-interaction was a thread in the tapestry of exclusion. But the stranger's question had been a spark. I could feel a shift inside me, subtle at first, a slow heat spreading through the numbness. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was clarity. For the first time, I saw my life in this house not through the lens of endurance or sacrifice, but as a ledger of what I had been giving away, my presence, my dignity, my claim to belonging. Later, as I moved quietly through the living room, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. The coasters, perfectly aligned in the corner where I was allowed to sit. The magazine rack, curated to ensure I never touched the main table. The living room light, dimmed just enough that my shadow seemed to shrink. And in each small, meticulous placement, I recognized a pattern. This house, this family, had adapted around me as a tolerated shadow, not a member. Michael wandered in mid-morning, coffee in hand, muttering, "You're staring too hard at nothing again, Mom." But I wasn't staring at nothing. I was seeing everything. His casual dismissal was another piece of the pattern. It was never his intention to hurt me, yet by choosing ease over awareness, he had been complicit in my quiet erasure. Laura passed by, her hand brushing the counter as she prepared snacks for the kids, eyes focused elsewhere, tone clipped yet perfectly polite. "Here you go, Mom," she said, passing me a plate with measured warmth. Every gesture polished, controlled, deliberate. Every word measured. I realized that these small orchestrations had been shaping my reality for months, if not years. In the afternoon, I sat by the window, watching the sun pool across the backyard. Jason's laughter drifted over, Lily's squeals punctuated the soft suburban hum. And then, almost instinctively, I began to plan, not revenge, not confrontation, but a quiet reclamation of space, of self. I thought of the catalog I had been keeping in my mind, the mental ledger of micro-abuses, the subtle cues of exclusion, the patterns of dismissal and redirection. Each observation became a tool, each detail a foothold. And I understood that the moment had arrived when awareness alone could become my ally. A neighbor, Mrs. Klein from 2 doors down, appeared in the driveway, watering her flowers, and waved. I waved back, casually, but noticed her gaze linger on me for just a beat too long. Her silent acknowledgement, her small observation, was another thread in the unfolding realization I existed here in their world, but not as a participant. A guest, tolerated, constrained, measured. And the realization that I had accepted this arrangement for months, quietly, patiently, ignited a resolve I had never allowed myself before. Evening descended with a quiet hum, the house settling into its practiced rhythms. Laura's efficiency had not faltered. Michael's passivity remained constant. The kids were perfectly obedient shadows of the mother they admired. But I felt something shift inside, a quiet energy, a recognition that for all their control, My awareness had grown beyond their influence. Every minor transgression, every microslight I had catalogued, now felt like evidence not of weakness, but of clarity. I was learning to see, to anticipate, to measure not just my steps, but my place, my boundaries, my worth. That night, as I moved through the hallway to my room, I paused at the doorway, noting the way the moonlight fell across the floor. Every careful step, every silent breath, every measured gesture had led to this, understanding that silence was my shield, observation my tool, and dignity my choice. I did not yet act, but I felt the stirring of intent. The ledger of exclusion I had meticulously compiled in my mind was no longer a record of suffering. It was a blueprint for the future I was quietly assembling. And that blueprint, delicate and precise, was mine alone. Ready for the day when I would step out of the margins and into the space I had earned through patience, awareness, and the slow accumulation of truth. Ready for the day I would choose myself, not as a guest tolerated, but as a presence fully recognized, fully unshakable. The morning began like every other, the house humming with its rehearsed rhythm, but I moved differently now. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to see what others couldn't. I tiptoed past the kitchen, noting the placement of the cereal boxes and the slight shift in the living room couch cushions, small things, almost laughable. But each a testament to the control Laura exerted over this space that I had once naively believed was mine. Michael was already gone, leaving his half-finished coffee on the counter. He muttered over his shoulder, "See you later, Mom," in that familiar tone that always implied, "Don't worry, I've got it all handled." But I did worry. I had learned, in these months of quiet observation, that his handling was exactly what allowed the subtle patterns of exclusion to thrive. He was peace over truth, ease over awareness, blind to the erosion of the space I had carved for myself. Laura appeared in the hallway, holding a folded laundry basket, her expression neutral, but every movement precise, a choreography honed to perfection. "Mom, can you bring this upstairs?" she asked. Voice light, almost imperceptibly commanding. I nodded, picking up the basket, feeling the weight of her expectation settle on my shoulders. It wasn't the weight of work. It was the weight of being constantly measured, tested, and found marginally acceptable. I didn't answer. Not because I was defiant. I answered with silence, and in that silence, I discovered power. Power not loud or confrontational, but quiet and inexorable. I began to catalog everything. The subtle tension in Laura's jaw when she handed me a plate of snacks, the way Michael paused at the doorway, checking for appearances rather than substance, the kids mirroring learned gestures without understanding. Every movement, every glance, every nuance became data, a ledger of invisible rules. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting in the sunroom, journal open on my lap, not for anyone else, but for me, to give form to the unspoken. I wrote down what I had observed over the past months, times when Laura smiled at a neighbor while redirecting me away, how Michael's casual remarks minimized my presence, the small but repeated exclusions in conversations at dinner. Patterns emerged, not just of subtle cruelty, but of a structured hierarchy I had been living inside, unknowingly performing the role of the compliant, invisible elder. I allowed myself a small, private smile. I was no longer a passive participant. I was learning the rhythm of their control, the patterns of their deception. Every minor misstep by Laura or Michael now registered clearly in my mind. One day, a glass of water had been placed slightly out of reach. Another, my favorite armchair, had been subtly angled away from the sunlight, almost as if to remind me that comfort in this house was conditional. And I noted all of it, not with anger, not with malice, but with precise awareness. The kids, as always, were shadows of their mother's lessons. Jason dragged a toy truck across the floor, pausing to copy a gesture from Laura. While Lily arranged her dolls in a manner that mimicked every subtle approval Laura had given her. It was unnerving, but illuminating. This household ran on a pattern of learned behaviors and silent hierarchies. And I was no longer naive enough to believe that patience alone would grant me belonging. That evening, a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, came by ostensibly to borrow a tool. He lingered a little longer than necessary, giving me a quick, knowing look before moving to speak with Laura. It was a brief interaction, almost nothing, but it was enough. In that glance, I felt a flicker of acknowledgement, an external witness to the subtle dynamics I had cataloged for months. It reminded me that observation was my ally, that, even unnoticed, I existed as a presence that could not be entirely erased. Michael passed through the kitchen, tossing a casual comment over his shoulder. "You're always writing in that thing, Mom." "What is it anyway?" I smiled, quietly, without explaining. It was a question meant to deflect, to contain me within my expected role. But I had begun to see clearly. His casual blindness was my mirror, reflection of the limits of his awareness, a reinforcement of my own strategic patience. By bedtime, the house was calm, but the stillness felt different. I could feel the small cracks appearing in Laura's controlled world. A slight hesitation in her step, a faint pause before directing the children, a momentary misplacement of a plate, subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were patterns now visible to me. Every detail, every minor slip, was a whisper that change was possible, that truth had a way of surfacing even without confrontation. I allowed myself a quiet moment by the window, watching the last streaks of daylight fade. I understood now that my strength lay not in argument or conflict, but in the deliberate cultivation of awareness. Silence, careful observation, patience, these were my tools, and with them, I was not merely surviving this house. I was preparing, quietly, to reclaim my space, my voice, my dignity. The ledger of small injustices, once a source of frustration and sorrow, had transformed into a blueprint. Each slight, each subtle exclusion, each micro-manipulation was now a piece of the architecture of my future actions. I did not yet confront, I did not yet declare, but I was ready. I had shifted from being a tolerated presence to an aware participant, quietly accumulating the clarity that would one day guide my choices. And as I lay down that night, I felt a rare serenity. The house hummed around me, the children slept, Laura's routines continued with mechanical perfection, and Michael's passive oversight remained constant. Yet, within me, a quiet revolution was underway. I had observed, I had learned, I had cataloged, and I was ready to act when the moment was truly mine. I understood, fully, that dignity could not be given, nor could belonging be assumed. It must be claimed. And in this silence, in this quiet watchfulness, I was preparing for the day I would finally step out of the margins, not with a shout or a fight, but with the unshakable authority of someone who had quietly witnessed, endured, and understood everything. The morning light streamed through the blinds, soft and indifferent, illuminating the familiar contours of a house that had never quite felt like mine. I walked through the rooms one last time, cataloging the details with the precision I had honed over months, the crooked picture frames, the faint ring where a cup had been left, the subtle crease on the living room rug where Laura had brushed it with that practiced perfection. Each mark was a testament to the order they demanded, the space I had been allowed but never owned. Michael was in the kitchen, reading the newspaper, coffee in hand, completely absorbed in his own world. He glanced up, saw me standing quietly in the doorway, and offered that habitual, casual nod. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice still carrying the comforting illusion that everything was as it should be. I smiled softly, without explanation. The illusion was theirs, not mine. Laura entered shortly after, a basket of freshly folded laundry in her arms. Her movements were flawless, as always, the efficiency a mask of control she wielded expertly. "Oh, you're up early," she remarked, tilting her head slightly, eyes calculating. "Don't bother with breakfast, I've got it covered." The words were polite, the tone neutral, yet underneath lay the subtle assertion of dominance, the unspoken reminder, "You are present, but only on my terms." I watched her for a moment, silently, with a calm that belied the storm I had felt for so long. I remembered every tilt of her head, every careful adjustment of my place in this household, every unspoken instruction that had accumulated into months of quiet exclusion. And now, after all the observing, all the cataloging, all the patient endurance, I realized something profoundly simple. I did not need permission to exist, and I certainly did not need permission to leave. The decision had been forming in my mind for weeks, a quiet crescendo building with each unnoticed slight, each casual dismissal by Michael, each silent manipulation by Laura. But today, the choice crystallized. I would leave on my own terms, gracefully, without confrontation, without accusation. I would reclaim my dignity in silence, allowing truth to rise not with a shout, but through the subtle clarity of action. I began packing, methodically, as if rehearsing a movement I had performed countless times in my mind. Each object I touched, a book, a scarf, a framed photograph, was carefully considered. Nothing was left behind carelessly. Every item carried with it a memory, a testament to the quiet life I had lived here, a life full of observation, patience, and resilience. The children wandered in, oblivious to the import of the morning. Jason fiddled with his toy truck. Lily arranged her dolls, and I saw in their mimicry the echoes of Laura's lessons, learned behaviors, repeated gestures. Yet this time, I did not feel frustration or sorrow. I felt clarity. Their mimicry no longer bound me. It merely highlighted the patterns I had long studied. Laura approached, noticing the packed bags, her eyebrow arched in curiosity. "Oh, you're leaving?" she asked, her voice steady, casual, betraying no emotion. She was not angry, not shocked, just observing, as if measuring the deviation from her controlled order. I nodded, returning her gaze calmly. "Yes, I've decided it's time to step into a place that truly belongs to me," I said, my tone even, dignified, unshakable. Michael appeared in the doorway, the casual ease in his posture faltering for a fraction of a second as he processed the scene. "Wait, you're just leaving?" he asked, a hint of unease creeping in, though he masked it quickly. I shook my head slightly, smiling with quiet strength. "I didn't need anyone's permission, Michael. I'm choosing myself." The words were soft, almost conversational, but carried the weight of months of endurance and silent observation. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line, a subtle twitch, and she stepped back, the perfect mask of control momentarily flickering. In that brief instant, the truth was visible. Her careful orchestration, her silent manipulations, all were impotent against the self-respect of someone who had quietly catalogued, patiently observed, and chosen herself. She did not shout, she did not scold, she simply acknowledged internally, reluctantly, the power of dignity unbent by performance or fear. I walked through the rooms one final time, absorbing the light, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the subtle echo of my footsteps on the wooden floor. Each moment was mine. Not taken, not borrowed, but fully, undeniably mine. I stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against my face, and felt a serenity I had not known in years. The house behind me was the same, familiar, functional, yet no longer defining my presence. Neighbors passing by gave a polite wave, a fleeting acknowledgement that I existed beyond the confines of this controlled space. I returned the gesture, a quiet smile on my face. There was no need for explanation, no need for justification. I had observed, I had endured, I had understood, and now I had acted. Michael lingered at the doorway, uncertainty in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw him, not as a son, not as a husband's extension, but as a man who had chosen comfort over clarity for too long. He did not understand, not fully, not yet. But the pattern he had ignored was now visible, undeniable, and he would reflect on it in silence, as all truths revealed themselves in time. Laura remained, her efficiency still intact, her control still practiced, but beneath it, subtle cracks showed where her careful illusions could not hold against the quiet strength of someone who had chosen herself. She had learned too late that silence is not weakness, that observation is not passivity, and that dignity cannot be contained by the walls of a house. As I walked down the quiet suburban street, bags in hand, heart steady, I felt the culmination of months of patient endurance. The small injustices, the subtle exclusions, the silent manipulations, they were no longer weights pressing against my shoulders. They were lessons, catalogued and understood, transformed into the quiet authority of someone who had finally claimed her own space, her own voice, her own dignity. And in that moment, I understood fully. They had never controlled me. They had only tested the edges of patience, the limits of quiet strength, and I had passed with clarity. I did not shout. I did not demand recognition. I did not seek revenge. I simply stepped out, full of quiet power, full of unspoken truth, and full of self-respect. I had been a tolerated presence. Now I was undeniably myself. And that simple act of choosing my own worth, my own space, my own life, was the quiet, irrevocable triumph that no subtle cruelty could undo.